Jobs empower individuals, reduce poverty, enhance well-being, and drive social stability and economic growth. Africa's largest and growing age group, its youth population, is also its least gainfully employed. Of Africa's over 400 million youth aged between 15 and 35, an estimated two-thirds are either unemployed or vulnerably employed. By 2050, Africa is expected to account for 1/4 of the world's working-age population, making youth employment a critical issue not just for Africa, but for the rest of the world. As part of the Oxford Martin School's Future of Development program, this podcast series, Africa Which Way Employment, delves into strategies for creating decent jobs that elevate incomes and ensure economic progress across the continent. Hello, and welcome to Africa Which Way Employment, a series dedicated to unpacking the continent's multi-layered employment landscape, showcasing individuals and initiatives that are driving positive socioeconomic outcomes, and inspiring actionable solutions to inclusive livelihoods, job creation, and economic equity. My name is Oluwatamilore Oni, and today I'm in Oxford and I'm joined by Morgan Hardy, a development economist and associate professor at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Her work focuses broadly on private enterprise development and employment in low-income countries. She employs a variety of experimental and applied methods, usually utilizing data originally collected from Africa. Her projects in Ethiopia, Ghana, and Nigeria cover many related topics, including combating youth unemployment, improving small business profits, community-level impacts on industrialization, gender pay inequality, and the dynamics of small business owner networks. Thank you so much for joining me, Morgan.
I'm really happy to speak with you.
I'm so happy
This is a really cool podcast series.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm really happy that you made time. I know that it's a busy time for you, and I appreciate you giving some of your time and insights and being able to share with us here. In this episode, we'll be discussing how to translate research into impact, what are the opportunities to lean into research synthesis and scale for small-scale to large-scale solutions involving government, policymakers, decision-makers, intervention implementers, employers, and job seekers to help solve unemployment. I think one of the things I've been trying to do with my guests is ask them about a fun job story.
Okay.
Do you have anything to share?
Job story.
A job search story.
This actually is reminding me of a story, and it's like a pretty prominent economist in development who told me. I was asking her how she got into economics, and I don't want to like overshare about her life. I don't know if she wants this, but just like to keep it anonymous. Like she said, I was like, how did you get into economics? And she said it was because of a name mix-up like this, where some person who, you know, academia can be very like power structured and there are gatekeepers and certain people have to invest in you. It's like an apprenticeship system. And like she had got this meeting with this person only because they thought she was somebody else. And then like it was this huge catalyst for her entire career. And now she's like really a top economist, like mover and shaker. And this name mix up was like the start of it all, which I don't know is kind of an interesting story.
It's really interesting because I guess jobs are central to like who we are and essentially a big part of our identity. And I think the purpose of this podcast is to really think through, for those who don't have access to jobs or don't have access to the skills that get them into jobs, how can we make that, open up that access and ease and I guess equalize the opportunity that, you know, meaningful jobs creates in people's lives. But I think just to kind of pivot to your own background and your research, you have over like 9 years of researching youth unemployment, small business profits, gender pay. How would you describe your research if you were to in a couple of sentences?
Yeah, it's like what you were just saying really struck a bell with me because I always explain that my research is about better understanding people's livelihoods because I think of livelihoods as so much more than a job. And I think jobs offer more than a paycheck for many people. And it's definitely true in a lot of high income country contexts where people kind of even introduce themselves with their profession as an identity source of the way that you like plug into society. But I think even if you're studying a woman in the south of Ethiopia who's migrating for a factory job that pays effectively $1 a day. Like, it's about the paycheck, but it's also about the livelihood is also coming from like hope about her future and the social structure she's embedding herself in. And so I think it's important to think about all of that at once. And I think a lot of my work, I focus on small business owners across the continent of Africa because, self-employment is a really key source of livelihood for many people, particularly for women. I also focus on industrial jobs because a lot of parts of the continent are trying to kind of get on that global value chain bandwagon as a source of livelihoods for, growing youth population. But yeah, I think if you try and look at a common thread, at least in my like early career research, it's been largely focused on livelihoods. I think in recent years, I've become increasingly passionate about what I call like a data gaps agenda, where in my pursuit of studying livelihoods, I've just recognized some kind of systematic data gaps when it comes to kind of women's livelihoods in particular, and, the way that data infrastructures are set up. They're almost siloed, where we have, the DHS and we focus on health, and then like, household surveys, they focus on household like agricultural activities or time use, or and then the firm surveys, they focus on businesses, and they're not super integrated across each data source. And where you find the women a lot of the time are in the like household and DHS surveys and not so much in the enterprise surveys. But if you know anything about the continent of Africa, women are the modal business owner, like if you actually look around. And so, but they're not documented in most typical firm surveys. And so I'm really interested in taking seriously, it kind of comes on the back of being evidence-based. And I think in my early career, the trend was RCTs and this push for kind of being more aware of evidence. But RCTs are only as powerful as like the spread of the data, both across time and across space. And, and if we don't have samples that represent people, you miss a lot. So, yeah.
I actually want to just pause on this, like the RCTs, and for those that don't know, randomized.
Randomized control trials. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for me, I find RCTs very fascinating. I don't have an academic background, and I think the first time this sort of crossed my own world path or worldview path is in 2019. I was in a grant making team, and we had made a grant to JPAL, the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, and they were doing a lot of RCT funding, and I didn't understand why this was important at the time, and I remember just being really fascinated by the concept of. I think there was one example was like a research paper that had talked about the signaling between job seekers and employers, and how a certain type of CV structure was more useful or had better outcomes.
I think that's
outcomes.
like Patricio, like there's in South Africa.
It was in South Africa, exactly.
Yeah, that's a good paper.
And I remember thinking, this is such a small piece of, say we wanted to fund a digital skills program. Typically you think about it, okay, you give XYZ funding and this organization delivers this training to young people, and then they start applying to jobs and they get into jobs. And then thinking about that, I guess value chain, if you want to call it that, CVs are just like one element of that. And I was wondering to myself, how do you then bring that small piece of evidence into building out a program that is useful and is effective and is also kind of delivering the outcomes that you want to? And so for me, that's the question for you as a researcher. How do you think about your work as one piece, as sort of like a micro piece of this puzzle of the microeconomic research, and thinking about, okay, how do we then use this to either inform or design or develop programs that are effective and are useful for those who need it the most?
I think it's like the $1 million question, but like, I think you're touching on a lot of really important things. One of them is, I think people were really excited about randomized control trials when they started kind of gaining favor. And I think part of the excitement about them, and I think what drew me to them when I was a graduate student, because I kind of started graduate school thinking I was going to do more macroeconomics, kind of cross-country studies of, informality, and I was frustrated with my inability to know for sure that something was true, because a lot of these kind of more cross-sectional, like, correlational studies. They're frustrating because you don't know the causal link for sure. The data quality is often not very high. And I really found randomized controlled trials attractive because for sure that if you do this to the CV for that sample of people in that period of time, in that contextual moment, the answer was 5. Or, it's very comforting in some way to really know for sure something. I think the critique of RCTs, and maybe what you're getting at when you say, okay, so that this CV matters, but how do you know that that's the most important thing? You didn't look at the other things. How do you embed this fact that and that's really valuable to know something, like, in your overall framework for what you should be doing now with your policy dollars? And that's something that I think it's almost like both a fair and an unfair critique of randomized controlled trials, because I think that's true of every research endeavor ever, whether or not you have causation or not. And a lot of these less well identified studies also suffer from limited external validity. By external validity, I mean whether you can take that finding and apply it to a different context or a different time. Yeah. And one of the things that I like to say to my students is, the best, I think I've mentioned this to you before, the best analogy I can think of for, evidence-based policymaking is this windshield analogy, where the policymaker, maybe you care about jobs in South Africa and you want to know, where should I drive this car? What should I be doing with policy for jobs in South Africa? And what researchers like myself are trained to do is to properly clean the windshield, but you can't clean the whole windshield forevermore. It's never going to be clear because data is expensive and evidence is expensive, not just expensive on dollars, but expensive on time and focus. And so you do, I think the RCT cleans the windshield really, really well, but it cleans it very narrowly and very temporarily. And then you can have other studies that maybe generally clean the windshield, but it's really foggy, or that's what I would think of as more of a correlational study that's very macro. And I think it's important to recognize the limits of the evidence that we are getting without throwing away the value of that evidence, and to understand that you are getting a fact, but it is in a broad reality. Yeah. That's a lot more complex than what you're able to see at the very surface in the narrow corner of the windshield that you've cleaned. Yeah.
I love that analogy, and I think it's really helpful in terms of picturing what is the value that research brings and how it can be applied. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, how can we just clean the whole windshield, right? Yeah. So that we don't have decision makers driving in this really foggy system. And I guess this is what we continue to do day in, day out, and try to figure that out. And I think you've kind of answered this question as well a little bit in what you just said about the time-space relevance of research outputs. And I guess also any other things that you would add if I were to ask, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you feel might be, either missing about understanding the role of research in addressing unemployment specifically in Africa?
I think that one of the biggest misconceptions is that facts are permanent facts, that, research is going to be something that's going to tell you the truth and the whole truth and forevermore truth. And that's not how research works. It tells you an educated guess at truth in a particular moment. And a lot of science, I think a lot of times people feel that scientific facts are, I think randomized control trials are just the new thing that makes people feel like they can absolve themselves of moral responsibility, because they say, oh, well, it's randomized and that's a fact. And so I didn't actually have to make any decisions about which babies get fed. But at the end of the day, you kind of are, even if it's indirect, because you choose what part of the windshield to clean, and you choose how to internalize the fact that you get from cleaning that part of the windshield and how much to prioritize that over maybe one other corner of the windshield that was cleaned recently. And everything, even the funding for randomized control trials or any kind of data collection, is coming from a lot of different sources, but whether it's public sources or billionaires with foundations, or it's coming from somewhere, and it's coming from personalities or agendas, or it's, I think, for a very long time, science has been man-made and evidence is man-made, and there's so much more. It's something that I work in a social science department, and I think it's much more vogue for anthropologists to have these opening parts of their books where they're trying to be upfront or reflective about their own personal biases and how it might color their data collection. And I think economics, even though we are, a rigorous social science that has causal estimation, there's so much that goes into the data that you collect and what you choose, where you choose to look, and that it's almost like if you think about this vast windshield and I know this fact, but it's like such a tiny fact, in the whole spectrum of what I could have looked at. So,
but in your own experience, and I guess with the research work that you've done over the last few years, are there like specific examples of where you've seen the research being applied in like really tangible ways? I know that there's work that you've done in Ghana. I was reading some of the work done in Hawaii about small businesses and how to improve productivity for women. And then also there's Ghana apprenticeship study about the quality of
the national
trainers. And then, what would you say? Could you share a couple of examples of projects that you feel like you've seen some tangible impact? And then also maybe thinking about what are some of the most or more innovative ways to then approach these sorts of research projects so that they do have more tangible impact?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're touching on probably something that I think about a lot personally right now, because, I've now been in this career for, I guess I switched to econ when I was 21 or something. I was doing theater at the time, and I was like, I need something more meaningful, and I switched to econ, and I'm now 37, and so I've been doing this for over 15 years, and when I got into economics, it's because I wanted to make people's lives better, and now I'm looking at this not long career, almost 2-decade career, and I'm what do I have to show for it? Can I point at something and be like, I made those people better off? And I don't know for sure that I can say that because you don't know for sure that the facts you're finding are still relevant, and you don't. But I think what I would say is in our profession as an academic, I just got tenure this summer, and the way I got tenure was by publishing in highly respected journals of my peers. And the incentives of our profession are to get quality publications out of our work. And sometimes those incentives can be at odds with kind of longer run, more embedded work in a particular context. And I think that I can't point to a particular example where I can say I made that program happen or I made that, but I think a lot of my finer moments in my career have been in things that didn't lead to a publication or data infrastructures that we have set up. Christian Meyer and I have spent a lot of time in Ethiopia really trying to think about the sustainability of the evidence infrastructure that we're setting up. So I think we don't like to kind of parachute in and get a fact and get out and write a paper. I think the real change is going to come from, instead of just cleaning a part of the windshield, you want to kind of set up a cleaning schedule for the windshield and think about that deliberately and figure out, okay, what is I think as we move into an era where things are just getting more and more digitized, it's both an opportunity and a risk, because if you do it well, you can clean a lot more of the windshield a lot more frequently. But if you do it irresponsibly, you can systematically leave out marginalized people's stories. And, I think this is really where, I think maybe because I'm thinking about these things at this stage in my career and I'm moving a little bit, I'm still working on a lot of randomized control trials. I'm embedded in these contexts with particular stakeholders I've worked with for a very long time, and I care about the livelihoods of the people I've been studying. But I'm also kind of, when I think more macro, I'm thinking more about these data gap issues and how do we make sure that everybody's getting their voice represented when we're moving towards these larger scale windshield cleaning endeavors. Yeah.
When you say data gaps, are these maybe from national surveys, or are these just what exactly how would you define a data gap?
Yeah, so my research is focusing on the data gaps related to entrepreneurship in mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, but so that maybe I'll use that as an example. But so my research is pointing out that I'm interested in particularly women's entrepreneurship and what we call the gender profit gap, which is kind of like the gender pay gap, but on the African continent, the modal form of employment is self-employment, particularly for women, and the average female entrepreneur is earning lower profits from her business than the average male entrepreneur. And so I have a whole series of papers that are trying to understand that, in the Hohoi context in Ghana, or, where I've done a lot of kind of long-run quantitative case study work to try and really unpack some of these forces. And my co-author Gisela Kagan and I probably, man, time is flying, like 5 years ago at this time, like kind of pivoted to saying, wow, we don't have a lot of like well-documented stylized facts about the gender profit gap the way that we do about the gender pay gap in the United States. We wanted to kind of generate these stylized facts. And we went about trying to kind of like synthesize publicly available data. And we quickly realized that, you know, most firms, censuses, most like statistical agencies that are systematically collecting data on enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa or the World Bank enterprise surveys, they're largely, we feel they're missing like a big part of the story, and particularly businesses that are more likely to be owned by women, but they often miss businesses that are not operating in a fixed location, not operating in a visible location. A lot of female business owners work out of their living room, or they work kind of moving around. And so, you know, thinking about when, you know, the government or policymakers or the World Bank is setting their policy agenda for like what they think businesses on the continent need, and they're only surveying formal firms with 5 or more employees, or they're only like it costs a lot of money to get this data, and maybe the original intent of that data was something else, like they wanted just some GDP estimate or some mining sector estimate, but we're using these data in a secondary way to set agendas moving forward, and there's big gaps in who's represented there. And so if you use, for example, we look for these enterprises in nationally representative household surveys where, you know, these are 8-hour-long surveys where you ask people everything from how's your kid doing to where'd you get water yesterday to, and maybe there's like sometimes a module where you ask a few limited questions about enterprises. We find that the share of enterprises coming from those surveys is just way more female-owned than the share of enterprises coming from these more, I mean, formal, informal, people have kind of known that for a while, but from even the informal surveys that are coming from the World Bank, or that, you know, the government of Ghana did a systematic census of all businesses back in, I want to say, 2012, but they approached visible permanent structures, and just you're missing a decent part of the population. You're getting different answers. So like the average firm in a household survey talks a lot more about issues with market access, and the average firm in a formal survey is talking more about governance and taxes. And so you direct your dollar differently depending on who you're listening to. And so I think, you know, people have been very focused on causation for a long time, and I think that's why randomized control trials got so popular. But I think sampling and data inclusion is almost, I'd almost rather have a properly representative sample for my question that has less of a clear causation insight than a really causal insight that's only representing a very small portion of the population. So
you actually just segued into my next question. So this question of like policy and systemic change, and there's this maybe not catchphrase, but the very popular phrase of evidence-based policymaking, or data-driven, or data-informed decision making. And we've kind of talked about this windshield and clearing out different spots of this, and also talked about data gaps. When it comes to this kind of what works mentality, so you have like the what works hubs, like, okay, this is what works for education, and we're trying to either get the data and then also deploy that into real world situations or programming. What is the relation? Like, how do you feel? And I think you've also kind of touched on this with like building out sustainable data or data infrastructure, or at least evidence building infrastructure. How would you, or what is most useful when you're thinking about policy influence and thinking about like p-values or like statistically significant? Like, how do you then either distill all that data and also all the information and the processing of that, something that is then actionable for policymakers and decision makers, and also them being aware that this is just kind of one piece of the puzzle and there's other things that need to be done? How do you communicate that when you're engaging with policymakers? Or what would you advise to researchers who are working in that space and trying to make their work more useful for decision making? And the reason why I say this is like, from a maybe heuristic perspective, maybe as a grant maker, I'm thinking, okay, I have XYZ amount of dollars to give. Where do I give it to? I don't want to read 10 papers or like sit down and figure out, okay, what is, which part of this is how do you then just distill that into ways that are more actionable?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like where my brain is going from this question is I feel like a lot of times academic economists are frustrated by the fact that they have a fact and they know it's right, and then they feel that nobody's listening to them. But sometimes I feel like they're not looking at it from the perspective of the people that aren't listening to them. And I think, I think it's really important that we generate our research questions and our designs in a kind of contextually embedded way so we understand what are the objectives of our partners. And, when I work with my stakeholders, I always try and say, I am not the driver of this car. Like, I don't, that's not my skill set. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you how to govern your country or how to run your program. Like, you have a particular expertise that I think a lot of times economists think that the only valuable knowledge is like quantitatively analyzed, rigorously designed research knowledge. But I think that there's a lot of value in practitioner knowledge, and I think that there needs to be, I think maybe something that people can identify more with is if you like run a household and, somebody could come in with like a correct statement, and, maybe you're like, I don't know, your kids are hungry, you're trying to make dinner, there's like a fire alarm going on, like, I don't know, and then somebody comes in and they're like, that wall color would be better if it were blue. And they could be totally right. And you're just like, dude, like, I'm making broccoli. Like, what are you doing? Like, I don't know. So, like, in a way, I think it's important to be like, if you're going to be the scientist involved in this situation, you should be humble about the importance of your fact. And but to an extent, because I think there's a trade-off here where, like, sometimes just because something's popular, just because something's not popular doesn't mean that it's not important. But there needs to be a respect and rapport and high quality communication between people with different skill sets and different roles in the car that's being driven down the highway. And I think sometimes there's not enough of those conversations. There's not enough space for those types of conversations. Yeah.
I think I'm loving all the analogies. I'm loving this one about the kitchen as well, because it's exactly how it feels like it's a small thing. And then how is relevant to what's happening? But it is an important piece at the end of the day. And
then if somebody wanted to come in and tell me a fact about like how to cook my broccoli in that moment, I'd be like, thank you for arriving. Like, so like it depends.
Yeah, but then without a wall, maybe there wouldn't.
No, exactly. And sometimes they're right that like you can't see it because you're cooking the broccoli, and they're right that the wall color would have made my dinner better, and maybe I don't see it because I'm busy with dinner, and like so that's why I say it's important for everybody to just be like humble and communicative in those situations.
Yeah, but I think follow-up question to that would then be, what do you think are the biggest barriers to them making this happen? So this being one, easing out the relationship or maybe tensions if there are frictions between the academic space and then the implementation space or the policymaking space or implementation and policymaking space. And then also any barriers to just your work as well. And also as you're thinking about building out or trying to bridge data gaps or at least shed a light on them, what are the kind of things that might be either roadblocks or obstacles to making that happen realistically for you and your research partners?
I mean, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm an economist, but I feel like incentives really matter. And I think there's a lot of misalignment of incentives where, like it's like what I was saying, a lot of my moments that I point to in my career where I feel like I made positive change are like completely invisible moments that never make it into a paper. And like, it's like non-promotable tasks are where a lot of the magic happens. And like, I think if there's any way, I don't know, if I were a donor, rather than funding the like 250th tiny cleaning of the windshield, I would try and think about incentivizing these kind of like overarching, like community generating endeavors that like provide both, I'd say like systematic planning of mindful planning of how we should be cleaning these windshields and when we should be cleaning these windshields, and putting together kind of cross-disciplinary teams to talk about that and creating spaces for that. And then also maybe just because of my own personal agenda. I think, data is, big data is on the rise. Things are getting digitized. I think we're at this really important moment for evidence-based policymaking where there's a lot of like easy data to grab in a lot of places, and it can be really seductive because you just really want to clean your windshield. But like, a lot of that data was collected for other purposes or is collected missing a bunch of voices that maybe you do care about. So being really mindful of what are whether you're doing something fancy with artificial intelligence or you're doing something simpler like a survey of 150 people, like you want to really think about who am I actually trying to answer questions about, and how do the people that I'm actually focused on, how are they representing everybody that I care about, both in terms of how they were sampled, but also in terms of the way that I'm measuring the things that I'm using and making my policy decision. So I think those kind of step back moments are things that are like harder to have when you're in the thick of the way that the current incentive structures are set up. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thinking of a few different things in terms of which direction, because on one hand, the incentives question or point is very important, I think, in terms of what does the ecosystem reward in a sense, right? And that's where the lose of efforts would tend to be directed towards, right?
As an economist, the ecosystem rewards publishing in a very small set of journals. Like that is what it rewards.
Yeah. But then I would also then to think about like the ecosystem of research. Let's even talk about like we're talking about unemployment in Africa now, for example, and there's a load of different development economics who are reading about this, researching about this, conducting RCTs as we speak, who are writing about this as we speak. And for me, the question of that kind of one spot, it feels like if there's one spot being cleaned here and one spot being cleaned on the windshield here, another spot, like, are there gatherings or opportunities for synthesis on a really large scale to bring sort of all these things together in a way? Or is there space to make that happen in a sense?
I think sometimes there are conferences where that happens ex post. Like people will have, let's do a conference about climate change and everybody will show up. I think there's a lot less like incubator spaces. It's funny, it's ironic. So one of the reasons that I'm here this week is because we're running like an incubator space for young scholars in economics from diverse backgrounds all around the world. But I think these early interventions before projects even get generated, or what questions we should be asking, or like, I think creating those spaces has a lot of value, because if you wait until after people have all chosen which corner of the windshield to clean and like, by their own kind of like disparate incentives, like that might not be the most effective cleaning of that windshield. Like it might be not the most efficient parts to be able to see. And then there's like a lot of focus on the parts that are clean, even if they might not have been the most important parts to have cleaned. Because you want to hold on to the things you can see, just psychologically as a person. Like it's one of the reasons I think evidence is valuable, because you're like, you could critique these tiny little corners of the windshield and their ability to inform where you should drive all you want, but like if you had a completely blacked out windshield, like that's terrifying. Like when you're driving down the highway, so it's like you'll work with the little bit you have, like So
yeah, for sure. I think maybe shifting gears a little to more like the future of work, and thinking about the path we're already like on, and a few different things. So one, like emerging technologies like AI, which you already sort of touched on earlier, and then also like labor migration is something that's on my head as well. Like it's Africa having this uniquely youthful demographic, and then also more developed countries having aging populations, and thinking about how do you exchange talent.
Yes, I think about this all the time.
And then also the question of if it's a thing where there's a stat where I think we need about 10 to 15 million jobs every year, because to match up with the population, and we only have like 3 million on the continent being created. So if the jobs are not created here, maybe then matching young Africans to job opportunities in other countries is useful.
You're like speaking my language. Like it's funny, we were at the dinner yesterday with the young scholars, and they were asking me like, what do you think are the areas of research that are like underserved? And I was saying, I think with climate change and how so many areas of the world are going to become increasingly difficult to live in, and those are the exact areas of the world where we're going to have the majority of the world's youth. And I think it's not that there isn't migration research going on, and there definitely is migration research going on. And a lot of it is kind of descriptive in the sense that they say, oh, when this shock happens, these people move here. But there's like less of this kind of entrepreneurial tinkering research going on the way we have with like microfinance, or, you know, there are these fields where people are like, how do we give a better loan to these people? Or, you know, I wish that, I think this is going to be one of the bigger policy issues of our lifetime, you know, is how do
I
you,
agree. Yeah.
we're going to have to move people, and how do you move people with dignity? How do you reduce the pain from that? How do you, I think those are things that we should be thinking about, that a lot of great minds should be focusing on, for sure. Yeah, and with the AI point, I feel like I'm in this class that I'm teaching this semester at NYU. There's a book that I have on the syllabus called Artificial Unintelligence, and it's about the fact that like a lot of people kind of misunderstand what AI actually is and what it's actually capable of, and it all goes back to data. Like AI needs data, and it's very much tied to the themes that I'm passionate about representation, because it's only as good as the people writing those algorithms and the data that's getting fed into those algorithms. And so
it's interesting, the point about like data and algorithms, and I think people have been predicting, at least trying to predict AI's impact on work for the last, I don't know, 10, 15, maybe more number of years. There was, you know, I think World Economic Forum that was saying, I think 90 something million jobs are going to be displaced, and then more recently, I think Goldman Sachs put out something where they were like, oh no, it's 300 million jobs that are going to be displaced. And it feels like more of a black hole in terms of nobody really knows, but everyone is just trying to, I guess, project, because that's what we need to do to try and say, okay, how do we prepare for this? But then I think the question there would also be, when there are all these data gaps in Africa, and you're thinking about, and again, when I say in Africa, I'm also very, and I'm sure you're also very cognizant of the fact that it's not like it's one monolithic place where everything is exactly the same, and there are different contexts, different countries, different perspectives, different cultures. But then it's the question of, I always feel like there is a need to sort of think about it as a block, because that is a useful way for progress in terms of how do you think about how are we joining hands and what are the similarities between our different contexts. But then to this question of, you know, there are data gaps about, you know, what we know and what we don't know, and then how we going to be represented, or at least maybe make the continent relevant in this AI future, or AI kind of focused future as it stands, as we sit down here today. When we feel like, it does feel like there's gaps that need to be filled, how can we position ourselves to be more competitive in this sort of labor market that is also becoming more fluid over the next few years? And is that something that you feel like research has a place to play in that space?
Yeah,
Maybe not so much.
This is like a big question, because I feel like it requires a bit of like a fortune teller ball, like, you know, because I think I mean, I was definitely wrong. I remember like Facebook came out when I was like a freshman in college, and we were one of the first people to get it. I went to college. I was at Columbia. It's like one of the first places I grew up in New York. And I remember hearing about it, and I was like, that is the dumbest thing I ever heard. Like, why would anybody want to like go on the internet and like put their face? And it's like, I am not a visionary when it comes to like what people are gonna want. You know, but and so even with AI, like I just I think that maybe I'm one of the people that I think if I were going to make a prediction, I think what's going to happen with AI, I don't think it's as effective as people think it is, because I think this is what the Artificial Unintelligence book talks about. And she talks about this idea of, what's the word she uses? Techno-chauvinism, where people think that you can have these technical solutions for everything. And I think one of the reasons I've designed this class for NYU Abu Dhabi is like, you know, it's an inclusive data literacy class. And it's because I think, you know, we require students to take university writing, because we think like literacy is a core skill to be a participant in a global society. And I think increasingly data literacy is like the new, you know, English literacy, you know, and I think I put inclusive data literacy on there because I think you really need to be aware of the limitations of data. It's not just knowing how to use data. You have to be really aware of the history of data and the power structures that create data, and the limitations of data, and all of that maps onto AI, where like, you know, life happens outside of the metaverse, you know, like, I don't know. And I think that, yeah, and I think, you know, it's like you were caveating this thing where, you know, not everywhere in Africa is the same. I also think people have this tendency, you know, I'm a development economist. That's the way I introduce myself, because that's how I was taught to kind of silo myself in a field. And I get, one of my pet peeves is when people kind of other places, or they say like, you even, like, I think there's a lot of commonalities between countries on the African continent and other parts of the world. And, you know, I study gender, and people will constantly kind of silo the world into like gender equal and gender unequal places. And I'm always like, no, we have problems with gender everywhere. And we have a lot of the issues that the African continent is facing, is there's, I think, yeah, maybe this is getting too nerdy, but like, I think there's like multi-dimensionality to characteristics where you could overlap with certain things and not other things in every place, like whether it's, if you want to group it by the African continent, or you want to group it at the country level, or even at the community level, you know, at the individual level, like you have your own unique story and characteristics and situations, and they're evolving over time. And then you can kind of have commonalities or non-commonalities with different places in different ways. And so your comment about how, you know, sometimes it's helpful to categorize things because you have to organize all this complex reality in some way to talk about it, you know. But yeah, I think, yeah, I've lost my train of thought. But I was making a point here. I have to go back to why I got on this. It has to do with the question you asked me about AI.
You know, I was asking what you feel like the role that AI plays in.
Yeah.
In
right.
helping to
Exactly.
solve-
So yeah, and I think like
research plays in AI.
and I think that maybe I'm just, if I were going to be a predictor, and I'm probably wrong because I didn't predict Facebook, is that I just don't think AI is going to be. Well, I guess I hope that it's not the core narrative of our lives going forward, because I think there's a lot of limitations to it. And I think it's increasingly true that I think big data and algorithms and AI are going to govern a lot of our lives. But I don't know that they're going to do it very accurately. I don't know, unless we educate. It's like why I want to teach this inclusive data literacy class. I want this next generation of leaders to be humble and aware. I want them to have this toolkit to use it for, because it's very powerful, and you can clean the windshield if you do it well, you know, but if you do it lazily, it can be really catastrophic. So like what I think about when I think about AI is it really depends on how we apply it. It's just a hammer, and like you can like build a house with a hammer, or you can kill people with a hammer, and like you have to be educated about the hammer and what it can be used for and what it should be used for. And that's all human questions, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think one of the things that you just said was like, you know, technology not being the solution to everything. And I remember having a conversation with Christian Mayer, director of the program, the Future Development Program. And we said similar thing as well, like technology isn't this silver bullet that, you know, you just kind of plug it somewhere and it like solves everything, right? So that's where's the community perspective there? How do you then utilize it to solve for that, as opposed to that AI itself directing the conversation? This is not in my notes, but as you were talking, it just occurred to me to ask, like, how do you feel, or do you feel like, how do you feel like, I don't think it's a do you, I think at this point it's probably a given, AI is impacting your research work. And I think because you already work with data anyway, as like, that's foundational to the work that you do. But how is it impacting the way you're viewing different topics, if it is at all, like in terms of like the gender pay inequality or gender profit inequality or
it's not,
employment
I guess,
or
is my
market
answer. Like
okay.
It's not. I don't know. I mean, maybe it should be, but you know, again, I'm the girl that didn't believe in Facebook. So
fair.
I don't know. But yeah, I think one of the things I was thinking when you were saying everybody thinks technology is a silver bullet, or like one of the things I've noticed, and you know, I've only been in this profession for like 2 decades at this point, but I've studied a lot of econ history. Like my undergraduate degree was philosophy, and like you see these trends in history where like people really want a silver bullet. Like they want a silver bullet, they want to fix things, they don't want to take moral responsibility for things, and you just see this theme over and over again throughout history where people find their new silver bullet and they like hold on to it. And I think technology is just the new one, or even evidence-based policymaking is a version of that, right? It's like what I said, where people say, oh, I'm an evidence-based policymaker, I didn't actually make this decision. this came from the evidence, and it's like, whether I think this, the How Data Happened book that I teach in my inclusive data literacy class, they open with a quote, and I can't remember whose quote it is, but it's just that data is never neutral. And like none of these tools are neutral. Evidence is not neutral. Technology is not neutral. AI is not neutral. I think whatever it is, it's really important that we continue to be critical thinkers that are human-based critical thinkers that are motivated. Going back to like what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, at the end of the day, I think we're all motivated. You're motivated. We're all motivated by improving livelihoods. And by livelihoods, I mean not just wages, like livelihoods, like people's like fulfillment in their life. And yeah, I think it's important to not lose sight of that when you're like kind of going down these rabbit holes of like techno chauvinism.
Yeah. I think some of the research that you're doing is coming up to 5-10 years of like impact and also I guess data collection. There's like the work in Ethiopia with like public employment services.
We've been working there for like 10 years and Ghana for like over 10 years. And
I think that sort of long-term perspective is very valuable. Are there interventions that you would say, or at least programs that you say have had? Again, I'm coming back to this question because I feel like maybe we can highlight one or two if we can during this conversation that you feel like have really strong evidence for improving the employment outcomes in the countries that you're working in. But if not necessarily the intervention themselves, maybe methodologies in designing those interventions.
Maybe I keep avoiding it because I feel like you're asking me for silver bullets.
Okay,
and like
fair,
one of the things that I have learned over like working in Ethiopia for 10 years is like maybe that's why I'm saying I'm going back to the methodology and the data systems because like the situation in the time that I've been working in Ethiopia has changed so drastically over time, and the best laid plans for whatever it is that we were doing. And when I first started working in Ethiopia, I was drawn there because I had this particular expertise in like labor matching with employers that I'd been doing in Ghana in a different context, and I wanted to think about it from like an industrialization angle. And we built this whole evidence plan around these women migrating to these factory jobs in the south of Ethiopia and trying to really take seriously understanding the impacts on their livelihoods and how to improve that impact on their livelihoods. And then COVID happens, and the global supply chain, like global demand, really like starts to collapse. And then you have like it's this misconception that you can just like go in, set up your evidence, get your answer, and then be like, I nailed it. Like, there's the policy insight. Forevermore, we're going to do pineapples for babies on Tuesdays, like, or whatever it is. Like, and that's just the reality changes. And I think one of the things that is really exciting about my job is that it's always changing. And I you have to be a really good surfer and to make impact. It's why I struggle to point to like a particular long-lasting silver bullet impact that I've generated, because I think I've just lost faith that those exist. And what you have to do is like little chip moments that just over time are just like a million things that you're doing over time. Maybe one example is like Christian and I, when the pandemic hit and the women that we had been studying that were migrating for these jobs started losing their jobs, we set up a quick phone survey to kind of just track what's happening to them. And then kind of like we wrote a couple publications in journals that don't give me much credit professionally, but fast turnaround, to like kind of draw attention to this population that we'd been studying in a way. Like, I think we did successfully draw resources to that issue because it's almost like we're like quantitative journalists, we were like, hey guys, here, this is happening. But then also like, is that good? I don't know. I chose to clean that part of the windshield. Maybe there's like some other invisible people that nobody was studying that I diverted resources away from. I don't know. So like, I'm a little bit, I could say that that's a proud moment for me, but I actually don't know the consequences of that moment for, everybody. So,
I appreciate you taking that sort of 360-degree lens in terms of really thinking about like, what are the unintended consequences? Or like, what are the spillovers or whatever it is that different interventions cause. And also the humility to think that, or to say that, first of all, the world is changing and has changed in the last decade. I mean, the last 4 months, like the beginning of 2025 to now, it's a completely different
for the rest of 2025.
TBD, exactly.
We'll see what happens.
So in reality, I think it's really grounding for me, actually, in terms of just this conversation and thinking about what is the power of research and like what are the limitations of research and how can you use research in ways that are useful now as much as possible to think about like the future and how as much as we can also predict, how can we sort of set up the structures and systems that would continue to help the people who need it the most, and then also people who are making decisions to make that happen.
I think creating spaces is really important. Like, I feel like it's funny because this has been an interesting conversation for me because you're helping me organize some thoughts that I don't normally have a conversation about. But yeah, I think like earlier interventions, like creating spaces pre-ideas is important.
Yeah. I think the final question just to wrap up is if you were to, you could answer either or. So the first one would be, how do you summarize sort of your thoughts right now about everything we've said? Or you could say one, I don't want to say piece of advice, but maybe one piece of nugget of wisdom to either policymakers. I remember you asked me like who's the audience for this, and I think for me the goal here is to draw attention to this issue on employment. I think it's so critical. So there was a piece at the Economist that essentially is ranking unemployment in Africa alongside like nuclear war threats and climate change in terms of like this is something that we need to solve now.
I've seen these. I don't know if it's the same article, but like they're basically saying like if you don't give livelihoods to these people, there will be consequences. Like, you know,
but it's not even a new narrative. It's something that has
exactly. That's why I don't remember the article because I've read it many times.
There's a few different there's been a few different.
When I wrote my tenure package, this is how I started it. I was like, this is why I study livelihoods.
And there's a ticking time bomb essential narrative, and I do think that it's really critical, and that's why we're having this conversation. But again, to whoever, might come across this and is thinking about, okay, what is the, I don't know, there's no I think from our conversation, but what are the different routes to bringing all the different actors, so if it's researchers, if it's people who are implementing programs, or if it's policymakers, or if it's funders, what is that one thing that you would say? And maybe to the point about creating spaces, but I'll let you sort of summarize.
Yeah, I feel like I'm much better positioned to answer from like my discipline, how I feel like economics, and especially like the PhD route of economics has been kind of, it's funny, we're like sitting at Oxford. I feel like it's a very old academic institution that's very ingrained in its traditions. And like the apprenticeship endeavor that is pursuing the kind of training that gets you to be in a position that I'm in is very focused on like a particular set of skills and a particular, training where I think there's a lot of relevant skills for evidence makers that are just not baked into the training that you get in these kind of like older institutions that are coming from a time where we did not have a lot of data and we did not have a lot of diversity and we did not, and I one of the reasons that, I think maybe I was drawn to NYU Abu Dhabi as a institution, it's a very new institution. So we're almost like the opposite of Oxford. We're like brand new, and I don't know how much we're going to be able to, we're still embedded in the broader academic infrastructure, and, we're talking about starting a PhD program, but I would love to think, if I ever have more time, I would love to think about a more up-to-date version of a training that would create people with these important skills. For all of the critiques of randomized control trials, and there was a Nobel Prize recently for a lot of the movers and shakers in randomized control trials, and I think like causation is like fine, but I think the real thing that randomized control trials or that movement did is it got people into the field. It got them out of the armchair and into the field and having conversations with people. And so at least on the, I don't know what to say about policymakers or donors or these other things. That's not my role, but on my end, what I'm hoping to do with the students that I'm advising is kind of more explicitly put a focus on, like our skill set is important. We have a technical toolkit of both modeling and empirics that's really valuable. But you're not as valuable a team member in this like car driving team if you're not self-aware, emotionally mature, understanding of the history, a good communicator. Like these are like really valuable skills, at least for being the kind of researcher that I think can be part of this solution. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would love to see more PhD programs like explicitly bake that into the training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that. I think also coming about out of the armchair and into the
Yeah.
conversations
Yeah.
on the field and the ground, I think is really powerful and potent as well. And yeah, we can wrap up there. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Yeah. Thanks for
Morgan,
having me. This has been
coming.
really interesting.
I
It's- I
appreciate
feel like
it.
I've been
Yeah.
in like a therapy session where you're like, what are you doing with your life? And I was like, I don't know, man.
I'm,
Like,
I'm
yeah.
glad you were able to
Yeah.
make it.
Yeah.
And to everyone who
Yeah.
listened and watched as well, thank you so
Yeah.
much for being with us.